Alright, welcome back. So in step 5 for this video, we're going to talk about balancing a budget. Now, there are two things that you could have seen, or really anywhere in between these two things, when you saw your first current state budget at the end of completing step 4. The first thing you may have seen is that you have a surplus. And if you have a surplus, that's fantastic. And there are a few questions you need to ask yourself. One being, where can I wisely invest this extra money so it can grow into even more? Secondly, what have I been putting off in order to stay within my budget? If you've been following a budget for a while, chances are you've sacrificed something that you really wish you could have in order to stick to your budget and to stay out of debt and to be financially wise. Well, when you have a surplus, maybe it's time to spend a little bit of that on something you've been putting off. And lastly, what else can I cut or eliminate to increase the surplus? The bigger your surplus is, the more power you have to invest and the more wealth you're able to build. So just because that box turns green doesn't mean you have to be done. In fact, it shouldn't mean that you're done. It means that it's time to buckle down and find that next level and see what else you can do to stretch your budget and to push your budget so that you can continue to build wealth. So the surplus, it's more of the fun side. It's you've arrived in a way. You're spending less than you earn, and that's a great place to be. Now the flip side of that equation is, what do you do if you have a deficit? Well, the first question you need to ask is, what can I cut or eliminate? Generally anything in that green elective column, either for savings for the future or in expenses, generally those are what goes first. However, as we'll see in an example here in a little bit, that's not necessarily always true, so you've got to be wise about where you cut. Secondly, would I rather work more, which means to earn more, or would I rather reduce or eliminate expenses? There are two sides to this equation. If you increase your income, you can eliminate that deficit, and if you reduce your spending, you can eliminate that deficit. So there are two sides to that equation, and you should look at both and decide which one is a better fit for you. And lastly, maybe the most important question is, where will my finances be in the future if I don't take care of these deficits in my budget now? If it isn't personal, if it isn't something that you take personally and that you take responsibility for, chances are, for most people, it's real easy to ignore. It's easy to push off. It's easy to figure that, I'll take care of this another day. But really think about, where am I going to be in a few years if I let this deficit stay? And the answer in the overwhelming number of cases is, you're going to be in an even deeper deficit. Not only your budget deficit, but your debt is going to pile up and you're going to be in a worse situation. So taking care of it now and making hard decisions is going to be a much better option than putting it off till later when those decisions become even harder. So with that, let's take a look at the example budget we had in the last video, and let's look at an example of what a person might do to start level loading that budget. So here's the example budget in the Excel version that we left with on the last video. We had all kinds of our expenses that we documented down here. We already kind of categorized them into what was necessary, flexible, and elective, and we also moved things into the savings category when it made sense. But when we're all said and done with our income and our tax included, we found out we have a sizable deficit to take care of. $1,600 a month is a lot, over almost $20,000 a year. And if you take a look here, we're looking at, in our elective categories, something around $8,000 to $9,000 if we eliminated all of that right now, and we need to get rid of $19,000. So there are some deep cuts that are going to have to happen here, or there's going to have to be some sacrifice to increase that income. So let's take a look at the process using the Excel version of what a person might go through to figure out what is their future budget going to look like in order to get rid of that deficit. So the first thing you could do is you could start with the elective expenses. You could look at things like charitable gifts for tithing, for example, and you just start playing with it. So you could decide, well, I do 30 now, maybe I'll drop it to 10. I still want to do something. Allowance, which is basically what in my family is just kind of fun money. There's nothing, it's not allocated to anything. It's kind of our freedom to do whatever we want. Well, if we're running a deficit, that's going to go away. It's not going to happen. Date night out is going to become date night in. It's gone. Internet, maybe there's a slower plan out there that is less expensive. Maybe there's a library nearby, and anyway, in this particular example, it's in here as an elective expense. If it was more critical, it wouldn't be an elective expense. So for this example, it's gone. Instead of going to the zoo, we're going to go to the free park. Instead of watching Netflix at night, we're going to get books at the library. Landscaping can wait. And maybe, and here's a good example with picture printing. It's in here and is an elective expense. But in my family, it's very important to document with pictures the history of the prior year. And so this is where you look at your budget and you think, man, that probably doesn't really belong in the elective category. So you take that guy and just move it over here. Copy and paste it and move it over, and then get rid of it on this side. So this budget is a living, breathing document. It does not have to stay in any certain way. It is yours to move around, to adjust as you see fit. Now notice, instead of deleting the entire thing, deleting the description of the expense, I went ahead and left them in there. The reason for that is someday I hope that our income rises and we end up with a surplus. And when that day comes, I still have documented here those things that we had to sacrifice in order to balance our budget. And so they're still there. And as the surplus rises, so can the things that we can add. So then you would just continue this. College funds, that's great for kids to go to college, but they can also work through it and pay for themselves. And when the family is running a deficit, college funds are simply not a priority, at least not in our house. Now, if they are a priority to you, that's fine, but they would not belong in elective. They belong somewhere in the necessary or flexible areas. So we've pretty much gutted the green areas here, all but tithing, which we decided we wanted to leave a little bit. So now it's time to move to the next column. We already decided the picture printing was important to us, but you know what? Maybe we can do with $50 would make us happy. Here's a category for propane, for a grill. We're probably still going to eat, and grilling is, one of the less expensive ways to do that, possibly. So I'd say just leave it there, and since it's only $50, it's not going to have that much of an impact anyway. Servicing our HVAC. If it's a newer system anyway, maybe you skip it for a few years. Maybe you go every other year. If it's an old system that you're trying to keep alive, and that $172 a year might be the difference between keeping it going for another few years or being hit with a really big bill of having to replace it, then I'd keep that there. Traveling, this just covers things like tolls and food on the road, something like that. So we may decide you're going to make a few less trips. Maybe you try to cut it a little. Again, home maintenance. Cut it down to the basics, maybe you cut it down a bit. Grocery stock up. Now this is something that might actually save money in our budget. By buying in bulk, we save some money, so maybe you decide to leave it alone. PTO, when you're in debt, the PTO doesn't get much money, or maybe they just get a little bit. So you just keep going on down the line, and you can see each thing that we adjust changes our numbers. We're already down below 900. We've almost cut that deficit in half. So you simply continue. Continue going down the list. We're going to spend less on gifts. Maybe Christmas is important, so we'll stick it there, but we'll give some folks cards and little things instead of buying stuff, or maybe homemade gifts. Maybe you decide I've got enough clothes in the closet, so for right now, I'm going to get rid of that one, and I'm going to live on what I have for now. We move up to the other flexible. Retirement savings is real important, but again, if you're deeply in debt and if you're running a large deficit, then it's certainly not as important in the short run, so it's going to be gone. So we simply continue on down the line. So we've gutted these first two, now we're to the necessary things. We're to the things that we can't really change that much. So car maintenance, the oil needs changed regardless of if you're in a deficit or not. Life insurance, maybe you cancel the policy, but the reality is if you cancel it and then you go try to buy it later, it's going to be a lot more expensive. Can't really change the trash bill. School fees, school lunches, maybe you decide you're gonna pack a lunch instead, so you can cut that a little bit. Your bills can't really change much. Maybe you can take your cell phone plan and downgrade it and get something a little bit less expensive. Probably leaving your dental insurance. Well, you've got health insurance, so maybe you decide if you're young and healthy and things are going well, maybe you decide that dental insurance isn't as important as you thought. But your health insurance for major things is still there. Electricity, gas for your car. Maybe you decide $120 for groceries. You're going to shoestring it and you're going to live on $80. And then you've got your mortgage. Moving is a big deal, and so keeping that mortgage intact is more than likely pretty important to you. So I'm going to say let's leave it for now and see what else we can do. So now we're left with 3 line items. We got our 401k, we've got our healthcare fund, and we've got our car fund. So you can take this and you decide which one is the most important. So in this case, your 401k, saving for retirement when you're deep in debt is probably not all that important. A lot of 401ks come with matches, so if you don't put in that amount, maybe you won't get a match, which is more or less free money. But nevertheless, when you're in debt, it's just not something that is going to be important. So maybe we cut that down to $100 instead of $200, and there you go. We're back in the green. So in this example, a person was living well beyond their means, and it resulted in a very huge deficit. So we simply go through the budget, we start cutting here and there. I went through it pretty quickly, but this is a process that could take days or weeks to very detailed decide what you can do with each line item in your budget and what you can live on and still find happiness and joy as you're living within your means. But this is an example of a way to do that. You'd continue tweaking and adjusting things as they go. But remember, this is just a spreadsheet. What you got to do after this is put this plan into action. You've got to get in touch with your 401k, with either your employer or with the people who operate the 401k, and you've got to have them immediately adjust the amount that's being deducted. If you have an automatic deduction for your Roth IRA, that's got to end immediately. Same for college funds. Your internet plan, you got to go cancel it. Your Netflix, you got to go cancel it. So your budget is not something just to look pretty on paper. This is your action plan. And every change that you made here in order to get yourself back in the green and get yourself back into a financial position of control and balance, each one of those has to be implemented after you're done doing it. Now let's take a look at an example that's a little bit different than the one we've looked at right now. Let's take a look at this budget. So again, we're looking at a budget that has a deficit, $335. But we're also looking at a budget where nearly everything, in fact everything, is in the necessary expense column. We're talking about rent for a roof over a head, pretty limited groceries, gas to fill up a car, basic utilities, a phone to be able to communicate, and maybe a little maintenance on the car. We're talking about a pretty bare bones budget, yet we're still looking at a budget that has a deficit. Well, this budget is based on what is roughly a minimum wage for 40 hours a week. And in this case, the problem, while some of these expenses may be able to be cut, maybe there's a reasonable place to live that's less expensive. Maybe a little more walking or public transit is in order instead of burning gas. I don't know. This is a made-up situation, but maybe some of those things can be affected. But to the tune of another $4,000, probably not. The total expenses are a little over $13,000. So to take this budget and to cut out 25% of it when everything in it is necessary, it's pretty unlikely to happen. We're talking about someone who's already living on bare bones, which means we're talking about someone who has an income problem, not an expense problem. So the solution for this person is they've got to get more income. They've got to find another way to get another paycheck and to earn a little bit more. Maybe it's working nights after that minimum wage job. Maybe they're still making minimum wage. If we pull up a little calculator here, we can see, let's say $7.25 an hour for another 15 hours a week is $109 per week. So 52 weeks a year. The Social Security and the Medicare, I've already got a formula in there that those adjust automatically, that person would have to look at their paycheck and see how much more in taxes they're going to pay. I'm just making some random guesses. But in this case, it takes income to get this budget back into the surplus, or at least the break-even range. So when you're looking at your budget and you see a deficit, it can be a spending problem, it can be an income problem, or more than likely it can be a combination of both. Sometimes the solution to get a budget back into the green is a little bit of both. It takes both, and if for each person it's going to be different. Some people don't want to sacrifice their expenses, so they would rather work more to earn more. There's nothing wrong with that. Some people would rather work exactly what they work now, but sacrifice some of their expenses so they can still live within their means. Neither solution is a bad answer or the wrong answer. Both of them work just fine, as long as the person owns that decision and takes responsibility for whatever comes from it. So with that, that's the end of our level loading section. If you run in a deficit, this is going to be a challenging step. It's going to be tough to decide, even though we've already kind of made those decisions by having the categories. It's still tough to decide what you're going to cut. It's real life, and it's real things that you're going to miss out on in order to live within your means. But that's why we have a budget. It may be painful, but living outside of your means, especially for a long period of time, is going to create far more pain than taking care of it now and getting within your means. So with that, finish this step. In the next video, we're going to talk about what I just call the system, which is how do you set up your finances to mirror the budget you've created and to manage it with very little time that you have to put in. So we'll see you in the next video.